August 15, 1945. Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across Japan, announcing surrender in language so archaic most citizens struggled to understand. For the first time in history, ordinary Japanese heard their emperor speak. Many wept. Some committed suicide rather than face defeat. All understood their world had ended. What they didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Allied officials were debating whether to prosecute Hirohito as a war criminal alongside Tojo, Yamamoto, and other Japanese military leaders. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, faced a decision that would shape post-war Asia. Evidence existed linking the emperor to war planning and atrocity authorization. Australian and Soviet representatives demanded prosecution. The emperor had reigned during Pearl Harbor, the rape of Nanking, Bataan Death March, and countless other atrocities committed in his name. By Nuremberg standards, where German leaders were hanged for crimes committed under their authority, Hirohito's guilt seemed clear. But MacArthur understood something that legal arguments missed. Prosecuting the emperor would require occupying Japan with a force far larger than available. It would transform cooperation into resistance and turn Reconstruction into permanent military occupation. The calculation wasn't about justice or law. It was about whether achieving symbolic accountability was worth the price of making Japan ungovernable. This is the story of why Hirohito escaped prosecution while his generals hanged. Not because he was innocent. Evidence suggested he knew about and approved military actions that became war crimes. But because the political calculus of occupying post-war Japan made prosecution impossible. The decision revealed uncomfortable truths about how justice after total war is shaped as much by pragmatic necessity as by moral principle. To understand why Hirohito wasn't prosecuted, you must understand his role during the war. The question of whether the emperor actually controlled Japanese policy or merely reigned as figurehead was central to the prosecution debate. Japanese constitution placed supreme authority in the emperor. All military actions were taken in his name. War was declared by imperial decree. Military officers served at his pleasure. On paper, Hirohito was absolute ruler with direct responsibility for everything Japan did. The reality was far more complicated. Japanese political culture emphasized consensus and collective decision-making. The emperor was expected to approve decisions reached by military and civilian leadership, not to make unilateral commands. This created ambiguity about responsibility. When military officers presented recommendations, Hirohito typically approved them without public dissent. Whether this made him complicit or merely ceremonial remained disputed. Evidence captured after surrender complicated the question further. Palace records showed Hirohito attended imperial conferences where war plans were discussed. He asked questions, sometimes expressed concerns, and ultimately approved operations. At the Imperial Conference of December 1, 1941, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor was finalized with his approval. Documents showed he was informed about operations in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. He knew what was being done in his name. More damningly, evidence suggested Hirohito had occasionally intervened directly. In 1936, during a military coup attempt, he unequivocally ordered rebels to stand down. They complied immediately. This demonstrated he possessed authority to command when he chose to exercise it. That he didn't exercise this authority to stop atrocities raised questions about whether his usual passivity was genuine constraint or convenient deniability. The rape of Nanking presented particularly damning evidence. The 1930 7193 massacre killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and POWs. Reports reached Tokyo while the atrocities continued. Hirohito received briefings describing what was occurring. He didn't order it stopped. Whether this constituted approval, negligence, or powerlessness to prevent military excess became central to prosecution debates. By Nuremberg standards, where knowledge without prevention constituted criminal negligence. Hirohito's involvement was problematic. Australian officials, whose soldiers had suffered in Japanese POW camps, were most vocal in demanding prosecution. They documented emperor-approved policies that led to prisoner abuse. Japanese military code, approved by imperial decree, contained provisions that contributed to POW mistreatment. Australian Justice Minister argued that if German leaders were prosecuted for crimes committed under their authority, equivalent standards should apply to Hirohito. Soviet representatives supported prosecution, but for different reasons. Stalin saw opportunity to weaken Japanese monarchy and create conditions favorable to communist influence. A prosecution that exposed imperial complicity in military aggression served Soviet geopolitical interests. Whether justice motivated Soviet position or Cold War calculation was unclear, but Soviet support for prosecution was consistent. American military officials were divided. Some, particularly those who had fought in the Pacific, believed Hirohito bore direct responsibility for atrocities committed against American prisoners. The Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino POWs died from abuse and murder, had occurred under Hirohito's reign. That he hadn't prevented such treatment, even if he hadn't ordered it directly, seemed sufficient for prosecution under standards being applied to German leadership. But Douglas MacArthur, who had ultimate authority over occupation policy, reached different conclusions based on pragmatic assessment of what prosecution would require. MacArthur understood, from intelligence reports and direct observation, that Emperor occupied unique position in Japanese society. He wasn't merely political leader but religious figure descended from gods according to state Shinto. Ordinary Japanese understood emperors as divine, fundamentally different from mortal humans. The psychological implications were profound. Prosecuting the emperor would challenge Japanese religious and cultural identity at its deepest level. Intelligence assessments suggested that such prosecution could trigger mass resistance, making Japan ungovernable without overwhelming military force. The United States had approximately 200,000 troops in Japan for occupation duties. Analysts estimated that securing compliance if the emperor were prosecuted might require 1 million troops or more, forces that didn't exist and couldn't be sustained politically. MacArthur's meetings with Hirohito, beginning in September 1945, reinforced his assessment. The emperor, speaking through interpreters, offered to accept sole responsibility for the war if it would spare his people further suffering. Whether this was genuine sacrifice or calculated rhetoric, it demonstrated Hirohito understood the stakes. MacArthur concluded that an emperor willing to cooperate was more valuable than a prosecuted emperor whose removal would destabilize occupation. The alternative to prosecution was transforming the emperor into a tool for occupation goals. If Hirohito remained on the throne but endorsed occupation policies, his authority could legitimize Allied directives. Japanese who might resist American orders could be commanded to comply by their emperor. The occupation could govern through existing power structures rather than attempting to create new ones from scratch. This approach required fundamentally redefining the emperor's role. The divinity claim had to be renounced. The emperor would issue statements, drafted by occupation authorities, rejecting his divine status and embracing democratic reforms. Hirohito would become constitutional monarch with symbolic but not political power. The transformation would preserve the institution while neutering its capacity for nationalist militarism. The legal framework for prosecution existed. The charter establishing the International Military Tribunal for the Far East included conspiracy charges that could be applied to anyone who participated in planning aggressive war. Hirohito had attended conferences where such planning occurred. His approval had been necessary for war to proceed. The legal case could be constructed. though it would face challenges regarding whether constitutional monarchs could be held criminally responsible for actions taken by their governments. The Nuremberg precedent was ambiguous. Nazi leaders prosecuted at Nuremberg were government officials and military commanders who had exercised direct operational control. No monarch or hereditary sovereign was prosecuted. Whether this represented principled distinction or simply reflected that Germany's monarchy had been abolished decades earlier was unclear. Japan's situation was unique. A sitting emperor who had reigned during the war's entirety and continued reigning after defeat. The evidence presented at the Tokyo trials deliberately excluded material directly implicating Hirohito. Prosecutors avoided calling witnesses who would testify about the emperor's role. Documents that showed imperial involvement were suppressed or redacted. This wasn't accident but policy. The prosecution strategy was designed to convict military and civilian leaders while protecting the emperor from direct exposure. The selectivity revealed that the trials served political purposes beyond simple justice. Japanese officials understood the implicit bargain. They were expected to accept responsibility and shield the emperor from prosecution. In exchange, the imperial institution would survive. Tojo Hideki, former prime minister and primary defendant, initially testified in ways that suggested imperial approval of war decisions. American officials made clear this was unacceptable. Tojo subsequently revised testimony to emphasize that the emperor had been powerless to prevent military actions. Whether this revision represented truth or coordinated cover-up remains debated. The domestic American political dimension complicated everything. The American public, which had suffered Pearl Harbor and years of brutal Pacific combat, wanted accountability, but public understanding of Japanese political structure was limited. Explaining why prosecuting the emperor was impractical would require acknowledging that occupation success depended on Japanese cooperation. Admitting this dependency would undermine narratives of unconditional surrender and total victory. The solution was to present the emperor as figurehead who had been manipulated by militarists. This narrative, while historically questionable, served multiple purposes. It absolved Hirohito while satisfying demands for accountability by prosecuting military leaders. It allowed the occupation to use the emperor's authority while claiming he had never exercised real power. And it established precedent that monarchs weren't necessarily responsible for their government's crimes. Convenient for other monarchies America wished to maintain in Europe and Asia. The January 1946 imperial rescript renouncing divinity was the price for non-prosecution. Hirohito, in carefully crafted statement written by occupation authorities, declared he was not divine and that the Japanese people were not inherently superior to others. The rescript undermined the ideological foundations of wartime militarism while preserving the imperial institution. It was humiliation accepted to avoid prosecution. The Allied disagreements about prosecution reflected different occupation goals. The Soviets wanted Japan weakened and destabilized. The British were largely indifferent, focused on their own colonial interests in Asia. The Chinese nationalists wanted accountability for atrocities committed in China, but lacked leverage to influence American policy. The Australians wanted justice for their POWs, but couldn't force the issue against American opposition. MacArthur's authority made American preferences decisive. The Cold War's emergence shaped the final decision. By 1946, Soviet expansion in Europe was creating tensions that would define post-war international relations. Japan's position facing Soviet territory made it strategically critical. A stable, cooperative Japan allied with the United States served American strategic interests. An occupied Japan in turmoil from attempting to prosecute a beloved emperor did not. Geopolitical calculation trumped legal principle. The long-term consequences of non-prosecution were significant but mixed. Japan cooperated with occupation, accepted democratic reforms, and transformed into American ally. This outcome validated MacArthur's pragmatic assessment that cooperation was worth more than prosecution. But the failure to fully confront imperial responsibility complicated Japan's reckoning with wartime actions. Without accountability at the top, historical narratives could portray Japan as victim of military cliques rather than participant in aggressive war. The comparison to Germany is instructive. Germany's political structure was dismantled completely. Nazi Party was banned. The state itself was divided. No German institution survived from the Nazi era to provide continuity. This allowed thorough denazification but required complete Allied control. Japan's occupation preserved imperial institution and governing structures while purging militarist elements. The approach was less thorough but more politically sustainable. For victims of Japanese aggression, the emperor's non-prosecution was bitter injustice. Chinese civilians who suffered occupation, Korean forced laborers, Southeast Asian populations brutalized by Japanese military, Allied POWs who endured camps, all watched the emperor remain free while his subordinates hanged. The message was that geopolitical necessity mattered more than accountability for victims. The calculation was pragmatic but hardly moral. The Tokyo trials proceeded from 1946-19 for 8 with carefully managed evidence that avoided direct imperial implication. 7 defendants, including Tojo, were executed. 16 received life imprisonment. Others got lesser sentences. The trials established precedents about aggressive war and crimes against humanity, but they also established precedent that political expedients could shield perpetrators when their protection served victor interests. Hirohito's post-war role as constitutional monarch demonstrated the success of MacArthur's strategy. The emperor endorsed democratic reforms, appeared publicly in unprecedented ways, and transformed from divine figure to symbolic leader. The changes were genuine, if imposed. The occupation governed through the emperor rather than against him, achieving compliance that direct rule couldn't have sustained. The pragmatic calculation had worked. But success in occupation goals didn't resolve moral questions. Evidence of Hirohito's wartime role remained troubling. He had possessed authority to intervene, demonstrated by his actions ending the 1936 coup and his August 1945 intervention to accept surrender. That he chose to intervene to end the war, but not to prevent atrocities, suggested selective exercise of authority. Whether this constituted criminal liability under international law was never tested because prosecution was never attempted. The historical debate continues decades later. Defenders argue Hirohito was constrained by political culture and military dominance, that constitutional monarchs shouldn't be held criminally responsible for government actions, and that his final intervention to accept surrender saved countless lives. Critics argue he approved aggressive war, knew about atrocities, possessed authority to intervene but didn't, and escaped justice through geopolitical calculation rather than innocence. The documents released over subsequent decades have generally supported the critical view. Imperial conference minutes show Hirohito asked detailed questions about military operations. He expressed concerns about specific tactics but approved operations that included targeting civilian populations. He received reports about prisoner treatment and didn't order improvements. The evidence suggests a ruler who was informed, involved, and complicit even if not operationally commanding. But the evidence emerged too late to affect the decision. By the time historians could fully assess Hirohito's wartime role, he had served as constitutional monarch for decades. Retroactive prosecution was politically impossible and legally questionable. The moment when justice might have been achieved had passed, foreclosed by decisions made for pragmatic reasons in 1940-519-46. The broader lesson was about how justice after total war is administered. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials established important precedents about accountability for aggressive war and atrocities, but they also demonstrated that victor justice was selective. Leaders were prosecuted when politically expedient and protected when pragmatically necessary. The standards applied weren't universal, but rather reflected power relationships and occupation requirements. For Japan, the emperor's survival shaped national memory of the war. Without accountability at the highest level, Japan could construct narratives that minimized collective responsibility. The militarists became scapegoats, portrayed as having betrayed the emperor and people. This narrative was historically inaccurate but politically useful. It allowed Japanese society to move forward without confronting the full extent of national complicity in aggression and atrocity. The contrast with Germany is striking. Germany was forced to confront Nazi crimes thoroughly because no institution survived to provide excuse or deflection. Japan confronted militarism but not imperial responsibility. German education emphasizes Nazi crimes extensively. Japanese education treats wartime actions more ambiguously. The different approaches to accountability shaped how each nation remembered and taught its wartime history. MacArthur's assessment that prosecuting Hirohito would make Japan ungovernable proved difficult to verify because prosecution was never attempted. Perhaps Japanese would have cooperated even without the emperor. Perhaps resistance would have been manageable with sufficient force. The counterfactual can't be tested. What's known is that the approach taken, preserving the emperor while prosecuting his subordinates, achieved occupation goals efficiently. The Australian and Soviet officials who demanded prosecution were overruled not because their legal arguments were weak, but because they lacked the power to enforce their preferences. American control of occupation policy made American strategic calculations decisive. MacArthur's authority to determine occupation priorities meant his pragmatic assessment outweighed moral or legal arguments for prosecution. The emperor's own views remained somewhat opaque. His post-war statements, carefully scripted by occupation authorities, expressed regret for war suffering but never acknowledged personal responsibility for decisions leading to war or atrocities committed during it. In later years, asked about wartime decisions, he typically claimed not to remember details or deferred to historians. Whether this represented genuine uncertainty or calculated avoidance of accountability was never clear. The final assessment must acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that pragmatic necessity shaped justice administration after World War II. Hirohito wasn't prosecuted because prosecuting him would have complicated occupation, required resources that didn't exist, and potentially created instability at a moment when American strategic interests required stable Japan. These calculations were rational, but represented triumph of expedience over principle. The victims of Japanese aggression received apologies from subordinate officials, but never from the emperor under whose authority crimes were committed. The legal precedent that monarchs might escape accountability for government actions in their name was established, and the historical record was deliberately obscured to protect the imperial institution from full examination of its wartime role. Whether this was necessary, as MacArthur argued, or whether it was simply convenient excuse to avoid politically difficult prosecution, remains debated. What's clear is that the decision shaped everything that followed. Japanese cooperation with occupation, American-Japanese alliance, Japanese economic recovery, and Japan's modern democratic institutions all developed in the shadow of the decision to preserve the emperor. The pragmatic calculation worked, but it left questions of justice and accountability unresolved, questions that echo through Japanese society and Asian international relations decades later.